Voluntary transactions. A voluntary transaction is one in which the transacting parties voluntarily consent to enter into the transaction. In order for a transaction to be voluntary, I believe the parties must honestly convey information pertinent to the transaction. This is because if pertinent information is not correctly conveyed, then the misinformed or uninformed parties can hardly be said to have voluntarily entered into the elements of the transaction that were not conveyed completely and honestly. Also, for a transaction to be voluntary, in other words, unforced, there must be no violence or threat of violence used to coerce parties involved in the transaction to participate in the transaction. A voluntary transaction might include a verbal exchange, a conversation, or even one or more people talking and one or more people listening, a physical exchange, a handshake, a hug, a kiss, etc., an exchange of property, such as a car, a watch, a house, money, a patent, etc., an exchange of the use of property for rent, and so on. Non-voluntary transactions are the opposite of voluntary transactions for the most part. Like voluntary transactions, non-voluntary transactions involve two or more parties to the transaction. Unlike voluntary transactions, non-voluntary transactions would lack uncoerced consent. Perhaps consent could be lacking because a criminal simply failed to obtain consent from the victim, or the criminal forced the victim to comply through violence or threat of violence without obtaining consent. Perhaps consent might be lacking because the criminal was dishonest and knowingly failed to fully disclose pertinent information, or provided false information, or at some point chose to not carry out his end of the bargain. In other words, the transaction did not end up being what the victim agreed to. Perhaps the consent was non-voluntary because it was coerced through violence or threat of violence. Non-voluntary transactions are basically types of theft of spiritual, intellectual, physical, and/or material property. Stealing spiritual, intellectual, physical, and/or material property without consent by means of dishonesty might include, but not be limited to, transactions involving lying, deceiving, bearing false witness, failing to disclose information pertinent to a transaction, presumptuousness, arrogance, including unjustness, bossiness, and name-calling, and/or taking advantage of incompetent persons. Stealing spiritual, intellectual, physical, and/or material property without consent, without dishonesty, and without violence by disrespecting boundaries might include, but not be limited to, breaking and entering, burglary, opportunistic theft, embezzlement, invasion of privacy, harassment, stalking, trespassing, and illegal immigration. Stealing spiritual, intellectual, physical, and/or material property with or without consent through violence and/or threat of violence might include, but not be limited to, murder, rape, robbery, and assault.